What is trauma anyway? And why is it important to be trauma informed? Hi, this is Living and Learning. I'm Karen Kugel, your host, and I'm happy to have with me today Thomas Brown. Thomas is president of the Eastern Massachusetts Peer Network. He has spent many years in the mental health, behavioral health field, and I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what he has done in it, because it's actually very significant and very exciting. And he's an expert on trauma and what he knows about it, not only in what he does as a profession, but he's also had some lived experience in this area as well. So we're going to get right to our discussion. Thanks so much, Thomas, for being on our show.
Thank you for having me here. It's great to be here.
So Thomas, tell me a little bit about what you do in this role of the EMPN, and also what you're doing in trauma right now, why it's so important.
Sure. So we'll start with the EMPN. Eastern Mass Peer Network is an organization that I co-founded a couple of years ago to support the new profession of peer support. It's not more than 20 or 30 years old in the nation, and in Massachusetts it's about 10 or 12 years old. And it's a profession made up of people with lived experience with challenges, so people who've had trauma or other extreme life experiences, extreme emotional experiences. They use that experience to support other people. So we have a natural empathy and a natural intelligence about extreme experience and about trauma, and we bring that to support other people. It's a little bit different from the clinical approach, which is kind of more people learning through a textbook and learning, different methods and techniques. We also go through a really intensive training, but a lot of that is to winnow our own lived experience and to use that in the service of supporting people.
I see. So for our audience, if you could give a clear description on just even some examples of how the medical model might work versus the peer support or recovery model.
Sure.
Yep.
Okay. So in the traditional or medical model, there's a power differential that often happens. So I'm the person, if I'm the clinician or the psychiatrist, I'm the person with the expertise. I've spent all these years in school, I've done my internships, my placements, and I have this expertise, and I'm bringing that to you. And in that relationship, I'm the doer, and I'm doing to you, I'm treating you. Okay.
Doing to.
Exactly.
Right.
So I'm bringing this knowledge, and I'm pretty much going to tell you what your treatment should look like and what it is going to look like and what you need to do to be in line with that treatment plan that I set for you. And if you look at that relationship, I'm the one with the expertise, I'm up here and you're down here. You're not really contributing a lot to me if I'm the expert. And you need to be pretty passive, so it doesn't really support self-determination or being active in one's own recovery. If you compare that with a peer support model, what you have is a balancing of those relationships. So we take that person who's up here and we bring them down here, and we recognize that we're both on, there's a mutuality, we're both on the same playing field, and that both of us are actually learning from the relationship, which is actually, that's what's really true about life, is that if we're really open, we're always learning from the other person. Any interaction with another person, no matter how brief, we're learning from that person. So in peer support, we really acknowledge that. And in a sense, I do have my expertise. That's based on my own lived experience. And you have your expertise too, based on your own lived experience. What's really important in that relationship is the mutual support that we offer each other. That's empathy. And what that looks like is this person saying, I've been there when this person says, I feel so horrible, or I feel so bad, or I feel so hopeless. And this person is able to kind of help humanize that experience and make it less isolated. Often in any kind of extreme experience in life, whether it's emotional trauma, physical trauma, disease, there tends to be an isolation and an alienation of the person who's suffering. And what peer support does is helps to erode that sense of alienation. And that is just one of the most comforting things we can experience as humans.
So you're saying that as you try to become or encourage this great equalizer feeling in a sense of mutuality, that the doctors or the medical professionals would also be willing to share some vulnerability themselves. Typically, my experience is that they don't do that. So you're saying that part of your training is to encourage them to kind of down, or how would you do that?
Absolutely. I actually teach in some universities here in the Boston area too. And I always encourage the people with the credentials to share some of their lived experience. As a matter of fact, the peer support profession has actually influenced the clinical profession. And what we see in social work, ethic books, and mental health counseling ethics books is this recommendation now that people, the providers of services, actually share a little bit of their lived experience to help build that connection with the other person. The old belief was that if you do that, you're going to monopolize the therapy session and that you're going to do harm to the other person, and that the person really needs to see us as something, you know, sterile and above it all, and that somehow they need that to look up to. The peer support profession has started to change that. And I think we'll continue to do that, and I think what you'll see is these professions slowly over time to look more like each other, and especially that clinical traditional model to start learning from the peer support model.
I see. So what in your own personal experience has informed you and got you even interested in this field?
Absolutely. Well, I was interested in both fields. I was trained as a clinician, and during that time, while I was doing my training, I discovered peer support and found out that, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is actually what I've been looking for all my life. Because when I found peer support myself, it was the thing that worked for me. It changed my life. It transformed my life. I stopped thinking of suicide when I found peer support. And so what influenced my path to where I am is that I have a 18-year lived history, my childhood and adolescence, where I survived really extreme violence almost on a daily basis. And then for 10 years of that, there was also sexual assault that I survived that happened pretty frequently. And when I was studying to be a clinician, I was looking for the answers, looking really hard for how do I resolve this, how do I get out of this? And I found a whole lot of different theories, and some things were kind of comforting, some things were a little helpful. When I found peer support, I found the thing that my whole body had been looking for, and that was acceptance, not to be judged, not to be thought of as something, a different kind of human. There's this kind of false belief that if you have so much trauma, at some point you fall off and you're a different kind of human. Now you're the sick person. What I discovered through peer support is there's just simply a spectrum of human experience, and any one of us can fall on that spectrum at any place, at any time in our life. And what I found with colleagues in this profession is that no one thought of me as being a different kind of human. You know, the dignity, my self-respect, that didn't have to go out of the picture when I was with these folks. It was all right there. I didn't have to act like a different kind of person. I could be really authentic. It was an incredible experience.
Well, that sounds amazing.
Yeah,
it is, and very helpful. So because it's peer support, it seems like by definition, is it only for adults? Or is there such a thing working with young people or teens? Or can you speak to that?
Yeah, a little bit. So I think it has tended to be more about adults. What we're seeing in Leominster right now, there is an effort to offer peer support in high schools. And so there's a really heroic initiative out there. And I believe we're starting to see that other places in the nation. One thing we're really starting to focus on in the state is the need for peer support for young adults. So that group of young adults from 18 to say 25 is a population that's often fallen off the radar in mental health. If they're in receiving services, childhood services, or adolescent services, often those stop being funded when they reach young adulthood. And so there's a really concerted effort right now to make sure that these folks have what they need. So the Kiva Center in Worcester, Central Massachusetts, is working on an initiative to really connect with these folks, and they're doing a lot of work. Kim Bissett here in the Boston area also has a training called The Give, which teaches these young adults with lived experience.
I'm sorry, it's called The Give?
The Gift.
The Gift.
G-I-F-T.
I see.
Yeah. And so she supports young people in learning how to be peer mentors, so kind of young peer specialists. So
Oh, that's very exciting.
It is,
It seems like there's
absolutely.
a huge need. I remember reading or hearing just recently that the suicide rate has gone up.
Yes.
Don't quote me on
Yes.
the number, but it was
Yeah.
something like 30%
Yeah.
since the 70s.
It's enormous, absolutely.
And that in particular over the last couple of years, it's been for young girls, young women, that it's really spiked quite a bit.
Absolutely, yes.
And it does seem to be very difficult from just the work that I do in working with teens, that it's very difficult to find a mental health worker who wants to or has the expertise to work with adolescents and young adults.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think that this fulfills a really important need out there.
Absolutely, absolutely does, yeah.
I wanted to talk to you and reinforce the idea that you are doing this in the state of Massachusetts. And we know that in our state, although Charlie Baker is supporting a lot of initiatives, I want you to talk about the opioid crisis, that this is a nationwide problem, but how does peer support help that, and how does your trauma movement overlap with that?
Sure. So underneath substance use, I would say almost always is trauma. There's been this false dichotomy, this false separation in mental health, that substance use was here, mental health was here. So there's been kind of an idea, a kind of false idea that it's shameful in the substance abuse community to have, to identify as having mental health issues. And what I do in my education around trauma is teach people about the trauma that's behind, that undergirds substance use. And when you look at the trauma, you go in, you talk about it, you explore it, and you start resolving it, the need for using of substances starts diminishing. What I teach is that people who are using, use to the degree that they need to. So if you've got really big trauma, like I had, like a lot of sexual assault, a lot of physical assault, you lived in danger every single day of your life, and there was also neglect in that, you weren't having emotional needs met, then the need to make up for it with substance can be really high. And I went through a period in my life where I used a lot of alcohol in order to kind of make up, to bring the level of terror down in myself, and to kind of make up for that lost sense of warmth, which I never received from parents. And so that's one thing we bring very powerfully to the opioid crisis, able to be there in trauma. Being able to talk about trauma in our culture is a pretty new thing. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was running a trauma and recovery group in a clinical setting, and I wasn't allowed to use the word trauma. Because the belief was that if I talked about trauma or even used the word trauma, that would be really bad for people. It would make people really unstable. People would fall apart. And what we found instead was just the exact opposite was true. It was by talking about trauma, allowing people to talk about, for the first time in their life, most of the time, what they've been through was the thing that freed them and healed them.
I see.
Yeah.
So when I think of trauma, the first thing that comes to my mind is PTSD and what someone who has experienced war on the battlefield has experienced. How does that relate to trauma and some of the people that you might work with? Do you work with veterans, or or where would that be on your spectrum of trauma?
I've worked with just about everybody. So I think there's another false idea, and it comes from what I call the classical period of trauma in the United States, which was everything before 2000 or 2005. And there was this idea that trauma was battlefield trauma. That's why it was PTSD. That's pretty much what trauma was. Mm-hmm. When I started therapy about 30 years ago, I had a lot of trauma, and the PTSD had just entered to the DSM-3 about 3 years prior, before I started therapy. When I went to therapy to talk about childhood physical and sexual assault, psychiatrists and therapists just kind of wrote it off. Some people suggested just be forgiving toward your parents or try to be understanding, that it wasn't that bad. And what I felt inside is like, I'm dying in here. I am dying of this. I can't go on living. This is so horrible. What's happened to me? I need to talk about it. And time again, I was kind of written off, that childhood trauma wasn't all that bad. What was really bad was the military trauma, people who had survived the Vietnam War. And there was a belief at that time, like probably up until through the 90s even, that people who had survived childhood trauma didn't fare so badly in adulthood. There were actually papers written in the 1970s, published in psychiatric journals, that, or at least one that I can think of particularly. A researcher argued that women who had survived childhood sexual assault actually fared better in adults because it made them more resilient and made them tougher. And research shows now that the exact opposite is true, that sexual assault is the most shattering type of interpersonal violence that exists, and the outcomes are far worse in terms of percentages of suicide, major depression, hopelessness, helplessness.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
I bring up that analogy of the PTSD because I think that that's sort of the go-to for so many people out there. And I think a clear explanation of trauma and its many forms and a broader description is much more valuable to us as people and how we deal with it.
Yeah.
So can you give some, you did give some examples about childhood or trauma, neglect, abuse. Can you give us some other examples of what you might consider trauma then?
Let me give you a really quick overview of what trauma is.
Yeah.
So trauma is an overwhelming experience that is really difficult to get through in a short matter of time. In other words, an overwhelming experience happens and 2 or 3 days later, 6 days later, you're still thinking about it all the time. You're still hearing the sounds easily in your memory. You're dreaming about it every night. Maybe you're shaking a lot. You don't have an appetite. You startle really easily. And what makes that overwhelming experience so salient are 3 main components, and that's hopelessness, helplessness, and horror and terror. So really big hopelessness, really big helplessness, and a whole lot of fear. And
a lot of H's.
A lot of H's. Well, in trauma literature,
That's how I'll remember it.
Those are the 3 H's. It makes it easy to remember. Now that can be all sorts of experiences, and you can, again, if you want to think of terms of a spectrum for traumatic experience, it can fall anywhere on there. Someone may be in a car accident and go on to become CEO of a company and just live, a really full life. A person who experiences the exact same car accident may be on disability benefits for the next 25 years. So there are a whole lot of things that contribute to an experience being traumatic. The really big one, the big piece that makes an experience more traumatic for one person than the other is the degree of unresolved traumatic past experience in that person's life. What are they carrying around in their nervous system? So we'll see the research is pointing to really early trauma, especially. If a person experienced a lot of neglect, wasn't touched, didn't have parents who really looked into the eyes of the infant or the young child. There wasn't a lot of touching, there wasn't a lot of paying attention to the pace that the child needed to go at, and the child was instead just kind of coerced through their childhood at the parent's schedule as opposed to the child's schedule. Then you're going to see a vulnerability in that person that for future traumatic events. And then another big one that research points to, and there's a ton of research on this, is birth trauma, so perinatal trauma, traumas that happen around the birth experience, either prior to it or right after it. So, for instance, if a child is born with an umbilical cord wrapped around their neck, that struggle that they go through at the very beginning of life sets them up for vulnerability later in life. If you compound that experience, and remember that the child, the infant, the infant is fighting for breath, they're fighting to survive at that time. If that's compounded with childhood neglect and then physical or sexual assault on top of it, you've got a lot of trauma. And then the person is in a car accident when they're 23, and boom, everything falls apart and they go on disability benefits. It's sort of like the nervous system had just filled up with trauma. It took all it could take. Then the last straw fell, and then they need to take a break from life. That was my case. And I had just had so much trauma in my life that at one point I had this one experience that probably wouldn't have seemed traumatic to other people, and it tore me completely apart. It knocked me off my feet for years. My body had just found that it was too much to carry on. The burden of trauma was just too great. So different types of trauma, there are, I think that things that we often don't think of as traumatic are things like poverty. Growing up in a housing development, maybe where there's a lot of violence, growing up in poverty where you simply never have enough, and the family is always in a financial crisis, what I call financial terror. That can be incredibly traumatic and leave a lifelong impact unless it's resolved. Breakups of marriages, divorces for the parents, divorces for the children. There are all sorts of things. Bullying, obviously, is a really big traumatic experience. I work with folks in prison, and often people who've killed, and they report over and over again that bullying was the most traumatic experience in their childhood and adolescence. It's really extraordinary. I have an 8-hour training that I wrote on trauma, and I spend 2 hours defining what trauma is. And it's a whole lot broader than what the literature historically and classically has defined it.
I can definitely understand that, and I also think that sometimes it's not helpful to even see it as you're describing it on, there's an overview, but not on a spectrum, because sometimes people feel, well, I went through this terrible experience, but it wasn't as bad as that. Yeah. And so they tend to dismiss it as though it doesn't count. Yeah. But what you're talking about is there's various forms of trauma, and how intensely it affects you in your life depends on the circumstances, how many other instances of things that you're also experiencing, and this kind of overload, and how you get out of it. And I think that's a way more helpful way to look at it, and for also clinicians to look at it in that way too, as opposed to, oh, it was a choice for you to become an addict, you know. But in many ways, this is not a choice.
No, I think there's very little choice in heavy substance use, extremely little choice, if any, maybe a little bit. People, you know, I've never met somebody who uses a lot of substances who tells me that, like, wow, I really wanted to use a lot of substances so that I could become homeless, so that my teeth would fall out, so that I'd lose my relationship, lose my housing. I've never heard anybody say that. What you see instead is a heck of a lot of trauma. And our culture, I think, tends to write off people who use substances in high amounts, especially around the opioid crisis. What I have heard just recently is that it's all about choice, whether a person, you know, wants to use or not. And yet, when I get those people in a safe space where they can talk to me, what I hear is their life is unbearable, it's intolerable. And I think if people could have the experience that I have, is like really listening to people, they would hear things that they would have a hard time fitting inside their worldview. You know, it's just so extreme. A lot of it's really unimaginable. There's so much trauma out there. I think one reason we haven't had the trauma conversations is because there just is so much of it. And I think acknowledging that makes a lot of us feel helpless and makes us really aware of our vulnerability going through life.
Do you think that the trauma that we experience, and that now at the very least we're willing to talk about it, also comes from the society that we live in now, where we don't have, not to say that everything was peachy and rosy in the days of the community, but I think it's more isolating now. Yes, we have social media, but it's not face-to-face contact. Families used to live more close to each other so that they can kind of look out for each other. Now people move wherever they need to around the world for jobs. Do you think that there's a societal aspect to this with the lack of support, or no?
I wouldn't doubt that there's something going on there. I'm a little suspect of that idea that things used to be really rosy and now things there aren't. What I see instead is a thread that runs through our historical culture, which tends to make us not value our connections as much as maybe other cultures do. But I see that going 100 years back. I don't think that's like a brand new thing. And I think we do have certain values based on our history, which are about a can-do attitude. I can do anything. And often in that is a kind of invulnerability, and that makes us less aware of our more vulnerable experiences. Maybe we're less sensitive to things that are more essentially human about us. And that allows us to be insensitive to ourselves, to our children, to people, other people in the world. So I think it's more of a cultural personality.
Cultural thing, yeah. Yeah, that is the American thing, that I did this I picked myself up from the bootstraps, and I'm going to ask you this, do you see any gender differences in this? Do you think that there's higher expectations of men to, not admit things and to kind of tough their way through versus women? Or do you think that what women go through in their trauma is just a little bit different, but they go through the same thing? Or are there any gender differences there?
That's a big one. So there are so many issues around gender in our culture and a lot of cultures around the world. Men have tended to view themselves as the dominant group in a lot of cultures. That creates a heck of a lot of problems. Women's right to vote wasn't given until around 1920. So that's, in a sense, women were seen as property, or not in a sense, they were literally seen as property, and even the women's property was seen as the man's property. So women's lack of rights and independence throughout history, which is only recent that that's begun to erode a little bit. There's still major issues there. That leaves a woman, a lot more vulnerable to traumatic experience. Any minority group that's experiencing oppression in any form is going to have a higher vulnerability toward traumatic experience. When one group is dominated by another group, it creates a helplessness, and often a hopelessness for that group. And it's something that we need to be looking at in our culture. We need to be looking at our culture and at different kinds of oppression through a trauma lens, and really take it seriously. If we see the traumatic effect that oppression has on different groups, it's hard to deny that real harm is being done there.
I see.
So it's not that women are different biologically. I mean, there may be some things there that I'm not aware of. I certainly don't see it that way. It's that the way that they have been treated creates the vulnerability. And the same thing for the LGBTQ community. For people with any kind of challenges, physical disabilities, you'll see this really high and high spinal cord injuries. That group of people are just often so neglected in terms of inclusion into society, but that happens with all minority groups or vulnerable groups.
Mm. No, I definitely can see that. It's something that I think about a great deal. But I'm
absolutely.
happy that finally people are paying more attention to and looking at it and defining it more broadly.
Yes.
So tell me more about the things that you do. Give me some examples and some outcomes that we can look forward to.
In terms of peer support?
In terms of peer support and being trauma-informed, what can we hope to accomplish through it? Or if there's any major studies that are even working on specific ways of looking at it?
Yeah. There's so much. I mean, it's first what we can expect to look forward to in terms of peer support and being really understanding trauma is a transformed world. When you have people who are walking into these helping professions who actually live this experience, you've got an entirely different flavor. You have an entirely different set of tools that these people are bringing to the table. They're real tools, and they really were because these people lived those experiences. You can't fake it. And if we rely simply on academic learning, we miss a whole bunch of those tools, and we don't even know that they exist, so we don't even know to use them. When we look at the world through a trauma lens, if we look at how universal trauma is and what an enormous impact that it has on all of our lives, if we can learn to be sensitive to that, we'll think differently, we'll govern differently, we'll educate differently. It's like becoming an entirely different human. What we have created in a lot of cultures around the world is an idea of a human that isn't necessarily based in reality. It's more intellectual. It has more to do with an ideal as opposed to what we are really authentically as humans. So I think both of these can transform us. There's a lot of research. There's been a lot of research on peer support. There is tons and tons of research on trauma now. It's the research du jour. I mean, it's the research topic du jour. It's kind of the big thing in research right now in psychology and psychiatry. I want to talk about two places where there have been some really amazing findings in terms of like working with people with a lot of trauma experiences, or people who are having a really hard time maybe experiencing crises in their life. Because I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of these. One of them is a peer-run respite in Northampton called AFIA, A-F-I-Y-A.
AFIA.
And what this is, it's kind of on a parallel with the psychiatric crisis or crisis stabilization inpatient treatment centers for people experiencing thoughts of suicide, or maybe they're starting to hear voices and experiencing a whole lot of distress and a lot of big fear. What happens in a peer-run respite is that there are no clinicians on staff. There's somebody available if the person using the services decides to use it. But instead, it's what you have are a lot of people who've gone through those experiences themselves, who are there staffing the program. And so people come in, and instead of being assessed for what's wrong with you and what are you doing, what substances are you using, instead they're greeted with somebody who says, I understand what you've been through, I've been there myself, and come, here, rest a while, and do what you need to take care of yourself, to get you through this. So they can have conversations about what's going on that are really meaningful by people who really understand those experiences. If they don't want to talk, they won't be forced to talk. They can just be with themselves and go through what they're going through in a really safe place. The research on that specific peer-run respite is really incredible. People actually have fewer hospitalizations, rehospitalizations after going through AFIA. That's really incredible. If you're a manager and you're a fiscal manager and you're looking at it in terms of money, that's really big. A person going through a peer-run restaurant isn't going to be going through all these really expensive hospitalizations for insurance companies. But just in terms of mental health, we see people often in the mental health system who go through hospitalizations over and over and over again. They just keep going. And what you're seeing out in Western Mass and AFIA is they just simply stop. People learn how to help themselves. They get really deeply validated. I think one thing that's really going on there is they're starting to experience themselves as a different kind of person. They've been viewed this way by the mental health system, and that didn't work. And they learned a different worldview, a different way of seeing themselves and experience themselves. They learned to be more self-determined and to use tools that actually help them to move through periods of distress. And there's a lot of humanizing that goes on in that experience. The other place I want to talk about is a place that just recently opened this past fall in Framingham, and it's called The Living Room. And this is an initiative that was supported by Advocates as part of Advocates, Mental Health Human Services organization in Framingham. And this is not necessarily an overnight respite. It's not where you would go to stay days and nights for like 5 days or however many they do in Northampton. But you can come there for the day and receive the same kind of thing that you would at AFIA. So you can just walk in off the street. Anybody can walk in off the street who's feeling distress, and you'll go in and you'll be met by peers, by people who've had similar experiences. So if you're feeling a lot of distress, then you can go and you can have conversations with people, or you can just go to feel safe. And there's an opportunity for some folks. I think they have like 4 beds or 4 chairs. They have recliners where people can stay in the recliners overnight if you just are having a really hard time. Sometimes what we need when we're feeling distress is to not be alone. We need to be with somebody who understands us, and we just need to move through it. And that's what both of these places offer to people. And we're going to see a lot more of these in the future. So I think that's one thing we can look forward to.
Sounds like wonderful options and opportunities for people. Yeah. But just to clarify, anyone who is experiencing that sort of pain where they don't know what to do, they feel like they need some help, regardless of where they live, whether they have insurance or not, you're saying that they can just go to one of these centers, just show up.
Right. Right.
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. In the living room, they have people just walking off the streets and into the living room.
So what initiative is driving this in terms of, is this part of the Department of Mental Health? Is this a private venture? Who is funding these kinds of facilities?
So I don't have all the information on all the funders, but the two big ones are MBHP for the living room and then the Department of Mental Health for FIA, the Peer Run Respite in Northampton.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
So there are, and you know, we get really creative in the peer support profession and community and finding sources of funding. So SAMHSA is another organization that funds some of these organizations, the Kiva Center and Central Mass.
SAMHSA,
yeah.
for my audience.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Substance
That's right.
Abuse, Mental Health, I forgot what the last two words are, but some of the association.
Substance abuse,
Yeah.
substance and mental health, and substance abuse of America.
Yeah, oh,
Something
that's
like
it.
that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
That's right.
Thank
That's
you.
okay.
I can never say
That's
it right off
okay.
the top of my head.
Because we roll it off our
right.
tongues, and it's like,
Yeah,
to
no.
people who don't
So they're
know.
in Washington, D.C., and
Yes.
so they're a national
That's the
government
federal
organization.
organization,
Yeah,
yeah.
that do a lot of funding for these programs. But there are places to get funding
Yeah.
for them. And,
Yeah.
and again, I think the more people hear about them, the more people will be willing and wanting to fund them.
Yeah. So speaking of that, how can they hear about them? How can people find out about that? These services?
Yeah, okay, so you can Google FIA,
Okay.
AFIYA in Northampton. And then also the living room, just look for
Just
the living
room. Okay.
Right, and Framingham, and you'll come to the Advocates webpage.
That's
and
great.
You'll find that, yeah. And I can provide information also if you want to put it
Yeah.
in credits.
Oh, that would be terrific.
Awesome.
Yeah, we can
Okay.
put for more information in the credit section so
Fantastic.
that people will have that other resource.
Awesome,
So.
fantastic.
So, if we have to sum up, what would be the one message, the one thing, or it could be more than one thing, that you want to leave our audience with about trauma and what we need to do as even just private citizens to better understand and to help people in our community who may be struggling?
I'm going to start with peer support. Don't discount the value of lived experience. For some reason, people have been discredited for having lived through extreme experience. In some cultures, they're actually the real heroes and heroines of those cultures, people who have survived really extreme experience, because it's understood that they've got the brilliance to help other people survive that, and that they, going through those extreme experiences, they bring back loads and loads of gifts that they can give to other people. We need to keep continuing to harvest that lived experience. We have tended to value academic experience over lived experience. That must shift. That absolutely must shift. There's a lot of value in academic, but lived experience, there's nothing like it. You can't get here what you get here. You can combine the two, which is kind of what I've done, and then you can get a lot out of that. In terms of trauma, wow, we just have to pay more and more attention to it, and to acknowledge that it's a much bigger part of our lives than what we've been used to. We need to kind of balance the way our worldview around traumatic experience and acknowledge that all of us at some point in our lives have traumatic experience. It's not relegated to people with mental health issues. So those would be my two big messages.
Humanizing trauma
Yeah,
to a certain
absolutely.
extent. You know?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And recognizing it in people that you meet that you just, in a sense, don't know
Absolutely.
what they might have experienced that might have brought them to this place
Yeah.
or whatever.
And yeah, I think one practice that would benefit us a great deal is just assume that everyone you meet has some trauma in their history. And if you really got to know people, it would explain a lot of the behavior that you see. A lot of the behavior that we tend to judge and pathologize is traumatic experience.
Oh.
So.
Thank you, Thomas,
Absolutely.
so much
Yeah.
for this. Really great, and I hope you enjoyed it. This has
Oh, I
been a
certainly
really
did.
great. I feel like
Yeah.
we could go on for days
I think we could.
talking about this.
Yeah.
And I'm really so grateful and happy that you're doing this, and that your colleagues are paying attention to this very,
Yes.
very important issue. It's so clear that our state is lucky that we have you and your peers and the peer support network and
Yeah.
all of these initiatives going
Yeah.
about And resources for people who may need them.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
And it sounds like at a certain point we might have all needed them.
Yeah,
and
no,
that's
absolutely.
The thing and that's
absolutely.
the thing to keep mindful of.
I just want to make one final statement.
Yeah.
We are very fortunate to live in this state because we have some
In
extraordinary people in our profession, people who use their lived experience, people who really understand oppression and trauma. It's an extraordinary state to live in. The fact that we have so many people, so many leaders there who are so passionate about improving and changing the state.
I feel that way too. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
I'm a Jersey girl, but but I have to say I love Massachusetts.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Great.
Thank
Awesome.
you so much
You're
for
so
coming.
welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and thank you for listening. And we'll see you the next time. And as an accent to this, we are also going to give some example of the language of recovery and trauma. So watch for our next episode that will do some role playing that will bring what Thomas is talking about to life. Okay, so we'll see you next time. Thanks again.